Hello, everyone. Hope you're keeping well. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on DevOps, the Launchpad for Digital. Thanks for taking out the time out of your busy schedules and joining us for this webinar. I'm quite excited about the webinar today, and I'm very sure that the session will leave you enriched and will be quite well worth your time. Let me start by introducing myself. I am Akshat Vaid. I'm an engagement lead with Zinnov's digital transformation practice. I will be your host for this webinar today. A quick introduction about Zinnov. Zinnov is a global management consulting organization with deep expertise across digital transformation, globalization, and product engineering. We are based out of India, US, Singapore, and China, and we work with some of the global leaders across technology, high tech, retail, BFSI, telecom, and many other verticals. For this webinar, Zinnov is collaborating with Pactera. Pactera is one of the global leaders in delivering world-class, best-of-breed digital solutions to its global clients, including a wide range of Fortune 500 companies. Pactera's innovation outpost, Moonshot by Pactera Digital, has a strong focus on delivering continuous, intelligent digital products that empower businesses and accelerate the use of advanced artificial intelligence and data concepts in products and experiences. Given Pactera's expertise in delivering next-gen digital solutions, Zinnov is proud to collaborate with Pactera for this thought leadership webinar on DevOps. Your speaker for the webinar today is Jeff Kirk. Jeff is the leader of Moonshot by Pactera Digital Innovation Outpost. Jeff at Pactera manages the strategic, architectural, and operational technology direction for their clients, the DevOps solutions. And this is at a global level from the Innovation Outpost. Jeff has over 18 years of experience, including over 10 years with Rosetta and Razorfish, both of which are digital agencies, and this is across multiple back offices, content, e-commerce, and mobility platforms. Jeff guides mixed marketing and technology teams to deliver world-class, best-of-breed digital solutions across various internet channels. Jeff is an alumni of John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio. So Jeff, it's great to have you with us today. We are just about to start with the session. Before I do, may I request all participants to be on mute? In fact, all of you are on mute by default. Please keep your laptop speakers on at the same time. You can share any queries that you may have through the chat window, and we should try and address as much as possible of those queries through a Q&A session at the end. In case any questions are left unanswered, we should certainly try and connect with you guys offline and address the same. If there is any additional information that you would require, or would you like to set up a time with our consulting team here at Zinnov or with Pactera, please email us at info@zinnov.com. It's info, once again, info@zinnov.com. So today we are going to talk about a very interesting and important topic. As you know, the topic is DevOps, the launchpad for digital. Today's enterprises are striving to reduce the time to market of new product features, capture user feedback, and respond to them by adopting iterative software development methodologies. However, the CIOs and CTOs are slowly realizing that even agile practices that do not factor delivery into them are falling short of their requirement. Enterprises are therefore, turning to DevOps practices to provide them with a competitive edge. In this webinar today, we will start by debunking some common misconceptions around DevOps adoption, and will further present what DevOps practices actually entail. We will be highlighting the top roadblocks faced by enterprises in their DevOps journey, and present our structured approach that should be followed by enterprises for a successful DevOps adoption. I'll now pass on the controls to Jeff. Jeff, over to you. You can proceed with the presentation.
Thank you, Askat. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to present today on the topic of DevOps in enterprises. Pactera has a large portfolio of clients that span a global presence due to the fact that we are embedded in so many different organizations across vertical industries, as well as within different countries and functional areas. We have an opportunity to look at DevOps from a high-level macro approach. And what we've done as an organization is created a strategic, high-level framework to allow organizations to enable their teams with DevOps ways of working that allow the organization to achieve goals, whether it be through time to market enhancements or through quality increases. As we work with organizations, we've determined that there are a number of phases of DevOps adoption. The first phase is the conceptualization phase, where enterprises are looking to improve time to market and reliability of their products, and exploring and evaluating different methods for process optimization, cost reduction, and customer satisfaction. The second phase of adoption is the planning phase, where enterprises who have decided to adopt DevOps practices start creating detailed plans around tools, people, and process changes. As I go through the presentation today, I will dive into each of the areas of tools, people, and processes to ensure that we drive home the fact that we thoroughly believe that successful organizations adopting DevOps must cover off on these three areas in order to have a long-term net gain related to their organization and the new ways of working that they've decided to embark on. Thirdly, there's the implementation phase. The implementation of DevOps practices starts with cross-functional teams undertaking pilot projects and streamlining processes through automation. This is a key point that we will stress on today. DevOps requires significant investment across people, process, and tools to automate all aspects of the software delivery pipeline in order to achieve the best results. And then finally, the review phase, where organizations need to look at the ROI of the DevOps processes that they put in place and continually alter and change them to make sure that the processes, tools, and people are all aligned with the velocity and time to market and quality needs determined at the conceptualization phase. Next, we want to dive into some of the myths that exist that are prevalent in each of the phases of DevOps adoption. Pactera and Zinnov have worked with our partners and other organizations and teams within those organizations to survey a large group of people to determine what myths are prevalent at this point in time. DevOps is obviously a very hot topic in the shared industry that we all work in, and we want to make sure that we provide a viewpoint as far as what are the true myths and facts related to DevOps adoption across the phases. So in the conceptualization phase, there are a number of myths that are routinely heard in the industry. First, DevOps is useful only for companies in a cloud product situation, potentially a software as a service-based company. This is not necessarily true, and in fact what we find is that DevOps practices can be leveraged by all types of organizations, independent of size, industry, or type of product being created. The second myth is DevOps clashes with existing processes of agile development and ITIL practices if your organization has employed those types of service design and methodologies within your organization. The fact is that DevOps practices can be considered as an extension to agile development and not clash with any of the ITIL processes that are currently in place. In fact, in many cases, it can complement those processes and methodologies. Third, in the conceptualization phase, one of the myths we hear routinely is DevOps is a bottom-up or grassroots approach. DevOps initiatives should be driven by the ground-level development teams or operations teams. The fact of the matter is that most organizations that are the most successful with DevOps will identify very quickly various types of initiatives that may be grassroots. But early on in those grassroots initiatives, key executives will typically make decisions to empower those grassroots initiatives, organize the appropriate change management in the organization that's required to ultimately bring the resources to bear in the organization that allow the team to be the most successful in adopting their DevOps ways of working. In the next phase, the planning phase, first myth we see quite routinely is DevOps requires a sudden overhaul of the entire tools and technology stack. This is not necessarily true. While it does require an introduction of a number of new tools, they don't have to necessarily be done right away. During the presentation today, we'll give a couple of examples of how organizations can look at their technology stack and then decide how to potentially introduce new tool sets into their existing workflows. The second myth is DevOps tools are important related to the people and process changes. The fact is that automation tools are at the center of DevOps, but DevOps is a combination of changes across people, process, and tools. And then third, DevOps is a skill, and hiring new DevOps talent is more important than training the existing resource pool. The fact is that many resources in the existing organization can be leveraged and be reassigned to new types of roles that can span multiple skill sets that bring the DevOps environment to full effect within the organization. The third phase, the implementation phase. The first myth we hear is DevOps initiatives require a separate department or group in order to be successful. The fact is that enterprises who have implemented DevOps, the department should eventually be merged with the development and operations departments so that there's a blending of DevOps skill sets across the organization. For successful collaboration within developers and operations team, the two teams should be located at the same place. This is typically a myth that we see due to the Scrum nature or Agile nature of many organizations and a lot of the stand-up type of meetings that occur. Many organizations feel that the team should be in the same location. However, teams can be co-located, and it is not mandatory that they are in the same location. In fact, geographically distributed teams can help by providing 24/7 support to application development and operations. And then finally, the last myth in the implementation phase that we routinely see is DevOps is just for engineers and operators and cannot be extended to other departments. Again, the fact is, to become flexible and responsive to customer needs and be a customer-centric organization, it is necessary to involve non-tech teams, sales, marketing, and design in the development process. And finally, the last phase, the first myth we hear in the review phase routinely, is DevOps processes can provide immediate quantifiable gains to enterprises. The fact is that developing a DevOps culture requires time and a phased manner of transition. While there can be a number of quick wins within an organization that are seen in the near term, in many cases, DevOps becomes a part of the fabric of the organization and will be continually iterated on and improved on over the months and years to come. So one of the most prevalent myths is that DevOps is a bottom-up or grassroots approach. And what we did was, when we looked at our survey of 60+ USA and India-based senior IT professionals, as it relates to DevOps optimization, we started to look at the information we are collecting from a prevalence of the myth and then an impact on DevOps adoption in the organization. And what we found was that there's a number of interesting areas here. So if you look at the only cloud-based companies can leverage DevOps, what we'll see is that in the industry, the prevalence of that myth based on our survey results is actually quite low. But there tends to be this notion that only those types of companies can actually leverage DevOps. So hopefully through some of this presentation today, we can help articulate that all companies and all groups can leverage DevOps in their organization. So what is DevOps? Very quickly, for those that on the call that may be using this as an introduction to DevOps for launching digital within their organization, we tend to think of DevOps as a software development practice which aims to bridge the divide between development, quality assurance, IT operations, and business teams to ensure continuous delivery and agility through automation, continuous integration, customer feedback loops, and building a culture of collaboration. This is a continuous flywheel that spans across people, process, and technology or tools. And when we look at each of these areas from a process perspective, we definitely want to cover off and make sure that any DevOps enablement program in an organization covers off on culture, collaboration, communication, and customer feedback mechanisms. And technology needs to also complement that iterative process where automation, infrastructure as code, integration, and release cycles need to be aware of the processes that are involved. Now, from a people perspective, the teams of people and skill sets need to be organized in a specific type of resource pool for your organization so that that team structure can ultimately provide accountability and openness and visibility into the software development lifecycle. So enterprises who have successfully implemented DevOps have seen a plethora of benefits across product reliability and time to market. There's an open source of information, which is a Puppet Labs State of DevOps survey that describes a number of DevOps benefits, whether it be time to market, people and innovation effects for your organization. And it's important to note that we put together a process that tries to give all organizations an opportunity to actually achieve some of these results, whether it be increasing the frequency of deployments, shortening the lead times to deliver functionality or features from requirements to deployment, ensuring that when applications are actually deployed, there are fewer failures. And then also, if there is a failure, we want to increase the ability of the organization to reduce the amount of time it requires to recover from that failure. So as we're going to go through this, we'll cover off on a couple of key areas. But what we'd like to do is show the main goal of DevOps is to ensure that code is always ready to be deployed. And the process we typically view from a DevOps cycle perspective is it's all user-centered. So we want to be able to make sure that users are experiencing the best experience with inside of the applications or experiences that are powered by DevOps. And so we try to capture requirements, insights, and feedback from those users via sales, marketing, and product management team members. We then create agile user stories to describe those capabilities that we're building into our application. We also take into account if the application is already in the market and it's in production, what are the existing bugs or defects that exist? And through triage, we try to incorporate those into the next planned release. And once we move through those two planning phases, we bring in the development teams to begin writing code to ultimately satisfy the requirements of the user stories and bugs. Once the developers have actually written the code, they check the code in through various mechanisms, depending on the type of tool sets or processes that are currently in place in your organization. And through version control for source control, as well as using multiple continuous integration automation tools, we ultimately are able to create a build that the quality assurance teams can consistently check through automated step-by-step test scripts for the user stories and bugs that are within the release. Once the continuous integration build is complete, the software delivery pipeline, which is at the bottom of the screen, can begin the process of actually building the code. The automated software delivery pipeline begins with a build phase. And then it ultimately, once the build is successful, it will deploy it automatically to a testing environment. When the deployment is complete, testing in an automated fashion can occur within the pipeline. Once the testing has completed and all test cases have passed successfully, the deployment to production can begin. And we then continue that process. So any issues found in the deployment can become bugs and cataloged correctly and ultimately be triaged for the next release. And also through continuous monitoring in production, customer feedback can ultimately be incorporated into the sales, marketing, and product manager workflow. Once we are in production, we can also do advanced testing, whether it be A/B testing, to ensure that customers and users are happy with our application. And if they're not, we can then ultimately go and incorporate the feedback back into the next release. So that's a quick view of the very high-level view of DevOps. So we look at this cycle, and there's a number of areas, whether it be the need to manage requirements, the need to create user stories, the need to triage and collect bugs and defects, the ability to create work items for developers, the need to continually build the source code as developers check in the changes that they're making to the source code. When we get into the actual build pipeline and software delivery pipeline, we need to be able to consistently and automatically build the application source code. We need to be able to deploy that, configure it correctly for the environment, potentially create transient environments with tools such as configuration management tools, such as Chef, or using containerization technologies such as Docker. We then run it through a battery of tests, whether it be functional tests, integration tests, behavioral tests, or security-minded tests such as penetration tests and load balancing tests. And then we ultimately move to deployment, where we do a red-green deployment with a number of different processes to ensure that applications and their users are throttled onto the new deployment correctly in production, while also receiving feedback along the way. So the way this ultimately comes to fruition in a real-life scenario, and this is an example of an organization's DevOps technology stack. What we'd like to do is try to map the various types of tools, whether they be commercial tools or open source tools, into the various phases of the build process for the applications. And we then also like to make sure that we have identified functional areas that the tools satisfy as it relates to the various processes and skill sets that we have in the organization. So if you look at this diagram in this technology stack from top left, and then move to the right and then down through the stack of technologies, you'll notice that there's tools, and these are only examples, where there's tools that are created to manage requirements for our applications. There's tools that are that are created to maintain traceability between various heterogeneous vendors' tool sets. There's tools that are created to actually store source code and then to store the artifacts of a build in a versioned and safe manner. And then as we move down the technology stack, we need to make sure that build automation and acceptance tool sets exist in our technology stack, the ability to create test scripts, manage those scripts and automate those scripts, provide automated security testing, automated monitoring, performance and profiling, and a number of other types of testing, whether it be from a load perspective or from a security perspective. Ultimately, a number of our applications that we're all building leverage numerous sources or large sources of data, and a new emerging type of challenge within a DevOps environment is how do you manage test data and schema tracking between various environments through an automated way of working. And there are tools now that exist to actually track and test the data as it moves through environments. And so when we look at that flywheel that we talked about earlier with DevOps, one of the common phrases in the industry is the fact that many of these activities shift left, and what that really means is that a lot of the operations-oriented activities will shift into the responsibility area of the development teams and testing teams. So many of the automated steps related to testing are ultimately done through code that represents a test script, or through a code that automates security testing, or through code that represents a configuration of the system, or code that represents the operating system itself, whether it be a virtual server or through a virtual container, such as a Docker container. And then it all moves all the way down to the operations aspects of your technology stack, where your RDBMS and NoSQL databases can be impacted, as well as your compute, storage, and networking, depending on the types of technology that you have existing in your organization. So as we move into the processes and people aspects of DevOps, it's important to remember that automation is certainly something that we want to keep track of. And what this ultimately means is that we need to make sure that in order to impact the culture of our organization and to make important changes to that culture, we have to change some of the behavior of the people in the enterprise. And one of the best ways to do that is to begin to create new processes and best of practice processes that ultimately allow us to change some of the behavior, rely more on automation, and then ultimately impact the culture of our organization. And so typically we adopt continuous feedback loops from customers so that we can quickly establish what's happening in our markets and be able to respond to product requests or feature issues in a more consistent and predictable way, but then also at a high velocity way to be able to respond to those feedback loops quickly. And then we also need to make sure that we improve on our communications internally within the organization and our communications channels from our customers to be able to make sure that we can make unified decisions, respond to emergencies or system down type of issues to make sure that the organization is moving along in a very efficient manner. A number of organizations' revenue, a significant portion of the revenue is tied to the digital channels and experiences that are currently in market, and we need to make sure that we have processes in place that can ensure that revenue channels are not impacted. And from a people perspective, the resource pool of people with the required skills should be created through a mix of hiring and extensive specialized training programs. So this is where we referred to earlier that we don't necessarily need an entire new group of people to implement DevOps in our organizations. There are many people that have a wealth of knowledge, whether it be related to writing code or scripting, and these are currently skill sets that are in high demand that may just need to be matched with new technologies or programming languages to ultimately bring the new solutions to life through DevOps. The second area that we need to focus on in people is really around that fact that the technology teams should be made more accountable for business outcomes. So we should look at adding KPIs to our technology teams and our developers within those teams that may be tied to lost revenue or protecting revenue, if you would. So it's important to make sure that we move beyond KPIs such as code quality and then move on to business-related outcomes for our development teams. From a non-technical product owner perspective, we need to make sure that they're involved in all project meetings right from the get-go. We believe that there's a role that's a digital product manager that is the voice of the business, but then also stays close to the sales, marketing, design, and technology throughout the life cycle of the creation of an application. And so we like to see organizations create this role that allows for constant coverage over the entire life cycle of the application. And then it's also important to become a metrics and high transparency type of organization where continuous progress tracking through dashboards that are accessible, whether it be through online tools or through monitors available in shared office spaces to be able to see the performance of the applications as they move through the design, build, test, and deployment phases, as well as operations phases of DevOps. Having these KPIs in shared spaces create a sense of community, and again, impact back to the culture of the organization to ensure that the entire organization is aligned to delivering a quality result for those individuals. So really quickly, only 20% of enterprises that have attempted to implement DevOps practices have fully deployed them. So this, these roadblocks ultimately exist in people, process, and tools because there's typically a lot of challenges in large enterprises as well as small organizations around how to best leverage the resources that are available to them. So from a people allocation perspective, we see routinely that the siloed nature of resource allocation can prevent some of the DevOps ways of working from coming to life successfully. And then there's sometimes a misalignment of responsibilities across teams and people where there might be duplicate roles and a lack of transparency or lack of communication around whose responsibility begins and ends with a certain step in the process, which ultimately can impact the velocity and add ambiguity and uncertainty to the process. Related to that, we see sometimes there's an inability to enforce culture change, and I think there's some ways in which organizations can look at different structures for their organizations and to align to whether it be product development life cycles and software development life cycles that can begin to impact the process changes required. And then also, sometimes there's budgetary constraints. We don't see budgetary constraints necessarily causing too much of a roadblock, but they certainly come up in conversations with clients. One of the good news is that many organizations leverage open source tools for their DevOps pipelines, and this ultimately has a great effect on the budgetary needs for the organization's DevOps capabilities. And then finally, from a technology perspective, some organizations just have a hard time and an inability to scale up DevOps. So the enterprises find themselves unable to replicate the success of the pilot DevOps projects throughout the organization. This can be related to fiefdoms on the people and process side of the world, incorrect balance of capital resources related to various business functions. And so this is where having an executive mandate or a top-down approach to DevOps can certainly empower your organization and remove DevOps roadblocks along the way. I'm going to move really quickly through the next couple of steps. So in order to circumvent these roadblocks that exist and ensure successful DevOps adoption, Pactera Digital and Zinnov recommend the following structured approach. It's a 5-phase approach that ultimately allows us to understand the current state of your organization's DevOps capabilities and then ultimately project a future state that your organization needs to actually implement the ways of working. So the first step is to align the organization's strategy. This is all about creating a charter and a mission for the organization related to DevOps so that all members of the organization understand the KPIs that are going to be relevant as they move through this process. Then we conduct a current state DevOps maturity model assessment where we cover up on people, process, technologies to identify pain points or significant areas where DevOps are currently successful in the organization. We then plan a future state and prioritize those focus areas so that we project out what your people, process, and technology future state looks like. We then establish a DevOps roadmap. So the roadmap is a series of initiatives for the organization that span people, process, and tools that ultimately allow you to, over time, achieve the best benefit to your organization. And then finally, the 5th step is the implementation and measurement, where we actually begin to implement those various initiatives that are on the roadmap. And then the implementation and measurement becomes a continuous iterative cycle that can eventually be used to measure your success and identify new initiatives that are required over time. So the way this typically looks like for an organization is in order to align the organization's strategy, typically it takes, in a concentrated way, 1 to 2 weeks initially, and then another 2 weeks, so 1 to 4 weeks to align the organization's strategy. And then there's typically another 6 weeks to assess the current DevOps maturity of the organization across people, process, tools. This is a component of the process where organizations should embark on interviews with key subject matter experts inside of their organizations, potentially seek guidance from outside subject matter experts in new change management concepts or tools and technology concepts to ensure that they understand how they currently rank from a current state maturity perspective. And then we typically go through with our clients a planning of the future state, where over the course of 4 weeks we plan a future state and we create a roadmap of initiatives to enable the DevOps. And then finally, implementation can span anywhere between 9 and 12 months or more. The best organizations embed DevOps into their future ways of working going forward, and so we see this becoming part of the culture and behavior, which is why the implementation and measure phase really never ends. There's only a need to potentially reevaluate KPIs and key performance indicators for the organization once DevOps has been enabled. So the first step, aligning the organization's strategy, when you're looking at building the charter for the alignment of the first step, it's important to interview top management, make sure that they have the drive to actually embark on the change management required to enable their teams to build software in a new way. So creating that charter, the second step of that is aligning to the mission, vision, and goals of the organization, and ensuring that the customer centricity is pulled into that aspect of it to ensure that the voice of the customer is heard in the ultimate applications we're delivering to market. And then there's a exercise in planning return on investment to make sure that budgets are aligned, and from a near-term and a long-term perspective, ROI is a key aspect of the planning. The second step, the detailed approach to the people, process, and technology maturity model, is to ensure that we understand what level, from a non-adopters to experts evaluation, the organization is currently ranked at. Some organizations are still performing, manual builds, manual testing. They may not have departments that are communicating in a very efficient way, and they also may have no collaboration tools or knowledge sharing platforms that allow their teams to work in a more efficient manner. And what we'd like to do is try to get them all the way to the executors or experts level in 2 or 3, where it's about automation, everything is code. We'd like to move to transient environments, having new ways to perform quality assurance through automation, and then building in that continuous monitoring to ensure that issues or new feature requests are quickly heard by the organization and the teams responsible for maintaining the applications, and then ultimately rolling that into high velocity releases that are delivered to the customers very quickly, and in many cases within days of the feature request instead of months from the feature request. The planning phase for the future, we would then typically look at how do you take the primary focus, what we learned in the organization's strategy and the current state, and align to what that prioritization looks like in people, process, and tools, to identify how we are going to move the current state of the organization to the right, towards more of the expert DevOps maturity state. And so we'll key in on a number of topic areas and ensure that from a, whether it be infrastructure perspective, let's say an organization is still on-premise and we would like to see them move to the cloud, to be able to create transient environments that live only when a testing environment is needed, and then only incur the cost of those transient environments while they're spun up and running to perform automated tests and then spin down and then stop paying for the utility attached to those cloud-based resources. So there's also a need to adopt more agile practices, and if organizations haven't invested in whether it be Scrum or agile coaching, we typically recommend initiatives around training people around new processes to move along the DevOps maturity continuum. And then the fourth phase of this process is around establishing the DevOps roadmap. This is a fairly complex aspect to the people, process, and technology for adoption. But what we'll typically do from people perspective is start to create a number of initiatives that help us organize and identify the resource pool that are specific to your organization's applications or industry, provide employee training, establish the proper team structure, and blended nature of dev, QA, and ops to smooth out the walls of uncertainty between those groups. Ensure there's new ways of responsibility sharing, and ensuring that there's ways to work in a highly transparent, open environment. From a process perspective, we put new communications mechanisms in place, establish collaborative tools and knowledge management platforms. Clearly, there's a number of new chat-based tools, whether it be for internal team usage or ticketing and chat-based tools to interact with customers and customer service representatives. We make sure that from a process perspective, from a configuration management perspective, artifact versioning and artifact automation are in place so that organizations, if there's an issue with a release, can quickly recover all versioned aspects of a deployment and release those artifacts to the blue-green environment very quickly. And then, as I said, the customer feedback mechanisms that are put in place are highly critical to the success of the processes. And from a technology and tools perspective, again, the emphasis here is on automation, whether it be from the build or continuous integration, infrastructure as a code, and release management and continuous monitoring. We want to make sure that all these areas are covered from a technology perspective to provide us with an end-to-end process to implement our DevOps. There's other areas such as application portability, the use of containers and virtual machines, or the orchestration of those containers and virtual machines, which is highly critical to the success of your new technology stack. We always encourage organizations to keep a lens on secure DevOps implementations by incorporating the info security departments and team members along this entire process from a people and process tools perspective to ensure that security is top of mind. And we typically reference this as sec DevOps adoption, or a hardened DevOps adoption of these processes in our organizations. And then we ultimately need to make sure we're impacting our release cycles and ensuring that all of our tools integrate well together, can speak together, and ultimately provide us with the best benefit of high velocity releases with high quality. And then we finally get to the implement and measure phase, where we look at selecting a pilot project in the organization. So typically it makes sense to identify a project that can be identified as a quick win, to be able to test a number of these capabilities, depending on where an organization lies in their current state. For example, they may be on an older source code management system that may impact how developers are able to access source code files at the same time, or manage branches that ultimately describe new features of the application that are being delivered. Depending on the state of the current organization, we select a pilot project. We make sure that we have a group of small cross-functional teams and people that are genuinely interested in DevOps, which is typically performed through some simple polling of your team members to understand how interested they are in ultimately performing on one of these pilot projects. From a continuous measurement perspective, which is the second phase of implementation and measure, we ultimately want to make sure that we're able to continuously measure through defined intervals with the right metrics and KPIs to keep an eye on where things are going well and where also things may not be going so well. And so by having that continuous loop and the potential to notify our blended dev and operations teams, we now give the ability for not only operations team members that may be embedded in our data centers or in our application monitoring environments, but then we also give the ability for the development team to also have a shared pane of glass where they can look at the measurement of their application in production, and the development team can bring solutions or suggestions to issues to the table before operations necessarily identifies the potential impact. And then finally, scaling up the DevOps processes. This is where we move away from the pilot and ultimately move to impact the entire application, the entire strategic program, potentially the portfolio, and then the organization. So the success of the pilot project should be evangelized across the organization to really make excitement and to drive those behavioral changes that change the culture of the organization. Then we try to launch multiple projects using DevOps capabilities within the organization, and then through iteration with multiple projects, the right fit strategy for the enterprises should be developed to scale up across the organization. So that takes us to the kind of future state of DevOps, where there's a number of initiatives that are going on in the industry as DevOps has matured over the past year or two, where there's growing automation and focus on artificial intelligence, where we can project a future where some of our application environments and applications will become self-healing and also self-learning, so that they can act on behaviors and patterns that are in the data about the application that is being continually monitored. So the things that are ultimately going to impact this from an architecture perspective, we're moving to this digital mesh of services, whether it be from a increased use of microservices, which is a popular architectural pattern that's currently empowering the integration of multiple services throughout the industry. The continued uptake of container technology is gaining momentum tremendously. While containerization was launched and originated through the Linux operating system, only recently, within the past several weeks, has the containerization capability been rolled out to Windows servers with the Windows Server 2016 release a short while ago. So this momentum should continue to increase tremendously as we move forward. Then from a technology perspective, really with the evolution of machine learning and AI and deep learning type of capabilities, and the ever-evolving algorithms that are being developed to understand patterns in that data we're collecting through the continuous monitoring tools, which are next to the AI in this diagram, we're turning into a very interesting place in our industry where we are able to see applications potentially be able to effectively mind themselves and heal themselves over time. Organizations are also investing heavily from a time and people and capital perspective into the areas of release, application release automation and application deployment automation software. There's a number of vendors that have significant enterprise as well as open source solutions for application release automation that's tied together the various heterogeneous tools, whether they be from various vendors or within a vendor lock scenario, that increase the workflow capabilities and integration of all of your tools in your environment. And then finally, from an infrastructure perspective, with the continued growth and reliance on the cloud, we are seeing that organizations are either moving towards adopting hyper-converged solutions for infrastructure, where they may be building out their own private clouds, or in cases where they may be moving to a public cloud, they're adopting technologies such as Mesosphere or Kubernetes, which are data center operating systems that allow teams of operators and developers to manage the orchestration and scalability and availability of their containers and virtual machines across numerous cloud and on-premise infrastructures. So with that said, I think we're going to wrap up this presentation, and we're going to open up to the question period for the presentation.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks a lot. I think it was a great session. I've been listening to you all this while, and I've been getting a lot of queries from the participants. I don't think we are left with a lot of time, but I'll try and squeeze in as many as possible, Jeff. So the first one that we have is around security. So the question goes as follows, Jeff. Where does security fit into DevOps? Especially when should we integrate security into the rapid deployment cycle?
Thank you, Oscar, for that question. To be brief, but be comprehensive, we pull security into our DevOps enablement programs at the very beginning by incorporating typically the chief security officer of the organization or one of their lieutenants that is empowered to be the decision maker in the very beginning planning phases. So when we're doing the planning and conceptualization, security has a seat at the table to understand how the operating systems, infrastructure, the tools can ultimately come together, and where the vectors are that could potentially challenge the organization. So after that kickoff and the conceptualization is completed from a security perspective, we typically see organizations creating a software security group that is embedded in the deployment and build aspects of the software delivery pipeline. We go even as far as to call our software delivery pipeline a secure software delivery pipeline, so that we're making sure that those tools are all incorporated, and the type of training is added to the process to make sure that security is at top of mind. So developers go through secure coding concepts training, the operations teams are trained on hardened operating system and infrastructure concepts. We leverage open source sources of information, such as OWASP, for the continually changing aspects of the security environments that we live in, to be able to stay mindful of the different challenges that exist in the security realm. And so effectively, the answer is security plays a role from beginning to end, and it never ends.
So there was a related question to this, but I believe you answered it to an extent, but it goes like this. Does Jeff see that security testing will continue to happen on post-production side also, that is operations? The reference is to slide 12.
Yes, and I'd be happy to also share some knowledge from one of my my peers that's a security expert. But we definitely see the need to continually monitor and perform, whether it be penetration testing, or any other type of vulnerability scanning in those production environments where it doesn't impact necessarily application performance, so that we are always aware of the evolving surface area that we are exposing to our customers.
Got it. Sure. The next question that I have for you, Jeff, is more it's more of an overarching question. So one of the participants has asked, what type of organizations is DevOps relevant to? So I believe if you can throw some light on the characteristics of the organization and the teams within for whom DevOps becomes relevant, I think that might help.
Sure. I think if we really had to place a magnifying glass on the types of organizations and their characteristics, they would be summed up in a couple of ways. First and foremost, the organization should be very customer-centric. Customer-centric organizations that are investing in their digital experiences have the need to provide new capabilities to be able to stay ahead of their competitors through high-velocity software delivery. Secondly, I would say that industries that have specific requirements around the absolute most high-quality software deployment. So, for example, organizations that may be deploying Internet of Things platforms where maybe they're potentially managing fleets of vehicles on the road, and they have thousands of vehicles across multiple geographies, and they need to roll out new capabilities to ensure that drivers have the most up-to-date information. DevOps is a way to ensure that the most high-quality releases get into the hands of those fleets and those operators as quickly as possible.
Sure. I hope that answers the question of the participant. In case there are any follow-up queries or request for any further inputs on this particular question or any others that we're just discussing, please feel free to write to us, as I mentioned earlier, at info@zinnov.com. I think we have a few more minutes, so I'll quickly squeeze in 2 more questions. Next one, Jeff, is what does continuous monitoring mean exactly? The person is trying to understand if it's using pager duty or looking out for app performance or more.
Sure. I think the most simple way to think about it, and since there's many ways to think about it, is that we want to be able to collect as much information about our application and the infrastructure that's running on during runtime. And so typically continuous monitoring has a number of tiers, aspects related to it. The first and foremost is data collection. So whether it be data collection at the network switch level or the characteristics of memory usage, hard drive usage, compute usage, and then collecting all of that in a common repository where we can then apply some of the higher order evaluation tool sets. There's tool sets such as cognitive tools that can look at large chunks of data and may be able to identify, for example, that a solid state drive somewhere is not working and ultimately causing certain percentage of your users to have slower response times, and then we know that slower response times impact our ability to earn revenue. There's a lot of research out there. So I think at the end of the day, the continuous monitoring is about collecting all of the wealth of data that we have available to us in the form of logs or that data, ultimately putting into a place where we can then deduce results from it, understand behaviors and changes, and then also give the team the ability to look at a single view of that data. So instead of operations team members and development team members or customer service team members having different views of that information, it's about really exposing it to them in a common way so that everybody's looking at the same set of data and can ultimately recommend new features or provide recommendations how to resolve customer feedback issues.
Got it. Last question, Jeff. I know we've already overshot the time, but let's just take this last one.
No problem.
Is there a recommended technology stack to implement DevOps, or can companies pick and choose different systems?
So I think that the answer is that your DevOps technology selection is certainly based on various characteristics of your organization. I think that given the emphasis on DevOps over the past 2 to 3 years, almost every single technology platform and technology stack at this point has some sort of a DevOps capability in those various functional areas that I described earlier. So whether you look across organizations such as Microsoft or organizations such as Pivotal, and there's a number of organizations that ultimately are providing a number of capabilities to bring DevOps to any platform that you reside on. And so what's important to do is it's important to evaluate those vendors and make sure that their tools going through some sort of a pilot ultimately work with inside of the culture that you're trying to create, and is something that is at least mature enough, depending on the state of your organization, that you feel comfortable in investing in and having them be a partner to you while you go through your journey.
Got it. I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, great, Jeff. I think with this we'll wrap up the show for tonight. Thanks a lot, everyone who attended today. I know there were a lot of other questions that we haven't been able to take up in the Q&A session, but in the interest of time, we'll wrap this up right now. All the remaining questions we'll respond to separately, over email. We'll reach out back to you. Thanks once again for taking out the time and participating in this session with us. We'll stay in touch. In case you have anything that you want to suggest or comment, or you just want to provide feedback or stay in touch, you can always reach back at info@zinnov.com. With that, thank you so much. Have a good day, good evening, good night, depending upon which geographies all of you are coming from. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.